That is supposed to be me, that's. What did I ever do to you that you would draw that picture of me?
Everything.
Super times for all. No danger about. In fact, let me tell you, if you don't work in a hospital, you really are missing something. In fact, you're missing everything.
Como que 31 agulhas foram parar no corpo desse menino? Você tá vendo o raio-x de um dos casos mais cruéis e assustadores da história do Brasil. 31 agulhas de costura espalhadas por todas as partes do corpo. Sou Thiago Santos e tudo isso aqui aconteceu em dezembro de 2009 em Ibotirama, uma cidade no interior do estado da Bahia, mais ou menos aí 500 quilômetros da capital Salvador. Um menino que tinha 2 anos e 7 meses começou a reclamar lá de dores e a mãe levou ele até um hospital. Parece que eles já tinham ido antes, outra vez, buscar atendimento, só que eles não descobriram nada. Mas dessa vez os médicos pediram um raio-x e todo mundo ficou assustado com o que viu. Dezenas de agulhas estavam espalhadas em várias regiões ali muito perigosas do corpo, perto dos pulmões, coração, pescoço, enfim, por tudo. Claro que ele teve que ser encaminhado para uma UTI o mais rápido possível e enquanto isso a polícia começou ali a investigar e tentar descobrir quem tinha feito aquilo e por quê. Depois de ser interrogado algumas vezes, o padrasto do menino confessou que ele era o autor de tudo isso e segundo ele, isso era uma coisa que acontecia várias vezes por semana. Ele disse ainda que para fazer aquilo tinham mais duas mulheres que ajudavam nesses procedimentos. Uma delas era a amante dele e a outra uma suposta mãe de santo ali conhecida na região. Detalhe, elas foram depois inocentadas por falta de prova. Mas continuando aqui, segundo o que o padrasto disse, eles faziam uma mistura ali de uma bebida para desacordar ele e aí sim eles começavam a colocar essas agulhas. E o objetivo disso aí, de acordo com o que ele mesmo disse, era que o menino morresse porque ele queria se vingar da mãe porque o casal brigava demais. Várias cirurgias tiveram que ser feitas para remover as agulhas, 3 cirurgias lá de alto risco e por sorte o menino não teve sequelas e teve alta em fevereiro de 2010. O padrasto, 5 anos depois, em 2014, foi julgado e condenaram ele lá a 2 anos e 6 meses de prisão. As 2 mulheres que, segundo ele, tinham participado de tudo isso foram inocentadas por falta de prova.
One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven. Where'd the one guy go?
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. His murders gradually progressed in violence, beginning with drive-by shootings and culminating in acts of cannibalism.
The Jonestown Massacre, 1978. America's most horrifying real-life tragedy. In the 1970s, Jim Jones, a charismatic but manipulative preacher, founded the People's Temple, a religious movement that attracted thousands with promises of equality, social justice, and a utopian society. However, beneath his message of hope lay a dark reality: control, manipulation, and abuse. After facing growing scrutiny in the U.S., Jones led his followers to Jonestown, a secluded jungle compound in Guyana, South America, claiming it would be a paradise free from oppression. But instead, it became a nightmare prison for over 900 men, women, and children. At first, Jonestown appeared to be a peaceful agricultural community. Cult members farmed, attended daily sermons, and lived under the strict rule of Jim Jones, who controlled every aspect of their lives. However, armed guards patrolled the area, ensuring no one could leave. Jones ruled with an iron fist, using fear, isolation, and punishments to keep his followers obedient. As life in Jonestown grew worse, some members tried to escape. Defectors who managed to return to the U.S. exposed the abuse, starvation, and mind control happening in the jungle compound. Their testimonies caught the attention of U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan, who decided to visit Jonestown with a team of journalists in November 1978 to investigate the disturbing claims.
Humans can lick too. The night I wasn't alone.
based on a true story. A beautiful young girl is left home alone with only her dog to protect her. On the news that night, they announced there is a serial killer on the loose in the area. Before she goes to bed, she locks all the doors and tries to lock all the windows, but the one in the basement won't lock. She decides to leave it unlocked, but locks the basement door and goes to bed. Her dog takes its customary place under her bed. In the deep of night, she awakens to a dripping sound coming from her bathroom. Half awake, the girl feels the comforting lick from her dog and falls back to sleep. She reawakens to the dripping sound, reaches her hand down to the dog where she feels the reassuring lick and falls back to sleep. Once more, she awakens to the dripping sound. She reaches her hand down and feels the lick of her dog. Now curious about the dripping sound, she gets up and slowly walks towards the bathroom, the dripping sound getting louder as she approaches. She reaches the bathroom and turns on the light. She is greeted by a horrific sight. Hanging from the shower nozzle is her dog with its throat slit open and its blood dripping into the bathtub. Something on the bathroom mirror catches her eye. She turns around. Written on the wall in her dog's blood are the words, "Humans can lick too."
Unsolved is a man who can slap but can also stroke.
7 tiny bodies, 1 garage, and a secret buried for over a decade. This is the chilling case of Megan Huntsman, the mother who turned her home into a house of horrors. In 2014, a man cleaning out his estranged wife's garage made a discovery that would leave Pleasant Grove, Utah in shock. Hidden among old boxes were the remains of 7 infants, wrapped in cloth, stored in cardboard, and forgotten. Megan Huntsman admitted she was responsible, confessing to strangling or suffocating 6 of the babies. The 7th, stillborn, she claimed. Over 10 years, she hid the pregnancies, concealed the births, and killed her own children, all while her family had no idea. But the question everyone asked wasn't just why, it was how. How could a crime this unimaginable go unnoticed for so long? And what led a mother to commit such a horrifying betrayal of trust? The Megan Huntsman case isn't just a story of unspeakable tragedy. It's a chilling reminder that even the darkest secrets can hide behind the brightest smiles.
However, coined the phrase, "You can't make this stuff up," might have known the story of real-life boogeyman, Albert Fish. A slight, elderly man with grey hair, no one suspected the kindly single father of being sadistic child murderer and cannibal.
This story isn't mine, but rather of my friend from Japan. I'll call him Rita. It happened back when Rita was only about 11 or 12 years old. Rita was a rather attractive kid and had his fair share of admirers. One girl was extreme with her crush though. I'll call her Ayano. Ayano was a lot older than Rita. She was 17. She was an acquaintance of Rita and lived down the road from him. Rita hadn't thought much of her until she started stalking him. Every day and every night, she would be following him one way or another, whether it be in person or online. Rita first started getting the creeps when she would start messaging him over 20 times a day. Stuff like, "Be safe," "Are you alright?" "Sleep well," etc. This was a little weird, but he overlooked it. Then the messages started getting creepier. Instead of the usual checkup emails, they got more personal. Things like, "You should eat your lunch," if he skipped lunch, or "I think your sister is hungry," when his little sister was crying. Rita stopped using both his phone and social media at this point, but it doesn't end there. Rita's mother was almost never home, so he was frequently looked after by babysitters. One day he had a new babysitter. It was Ayano. Nothing was particularly strange as she looked after him and his siblings, but she did get a lot closer to his mother than he would like. One day at school, Ayano approached Rita and told him that his mother would be out of the country for a week. and that she told her to let Rita stay at her house. Rita was hesitant at first, but hey, it was his mother's wish. He couldn't go against that. Ayano told him that his mother had already left, so he could go home with her after school that day. Rita reluctantly agreed and went home with her. When he got there, her parents weren't home. Things get a little blurry here as my friend choked up telling the story, as it still scares him today. He said Ayano would play weird games with him, stuff like Family, where she insisted she was the wife and he was the husband, as well as things like Cops and Robbers and games to see who would get scared first, where she would blindfold him and leave him in a silent room for hours on end. It was 5 days into staying at her house, and Ayano had gone to her part-time job. She had left the doors locked and the windows were too high to jump from, so he just stayed in front of the TV, where he saw a chilling news report. It was a missing child report, the missing child being him. Before he had the time to catch the number to call, the TV switched off, and Ayano was standing behind him with the remote in her hand. Rita had freaked out, crying and screaming. Ayano held him, but he managed to wiggle from her grasp just in time to open a window and cry for help. Luckily for him, a couple were walking past, heard his cries and called the police. Within an hour, police arrived and found him locked in her bedroom with a blindfold and his hands tied. Due to Ayano still being a minor, Rita is unsure of what happened to her. He says he only remembers the police taking her away while his mother was hugging him. He moved to Australia after this and hasn't seen his kidnapper since, but he still cowers at the sound of her name.
The following story occurred in the summer of 2005. I lived in Athens, Georgia, and attended the University of Georgia. At the time, my girlfriend, now wife, lived in Atlanta, which was about a 65-mile drive from my hometown. The highway which takes you to Atlanta from Athens is a 2-lane highway called 316. This is important information for the story. It was a Sunday evening. I had spent the weekend in Atlanta and was now driving back to Athens. In the summer, there are very few cars on the road on Sunday evenings, as many of the students go home for the summer. I was driving a black BMW SUV and was cruising along listening to music. I saw no cars for miles and was approaching a traffic light along 316. The traffic light was red, and I came to a stop alongside an old Mustang. It looked like one of those models from the 1980s, was black in color with a rag top. The windows of the vehicle were tinted. I didn't really give the car a second thought. I just sat there and waited for the light to turn green. When it did, the Mustang suddenly sped off with a squeal of the tires. As if the driver floored it from the idle position, the car sped off far in front of me. I was a bit surprised, but I just thought, yeah, another redneck, who cares? The Mustang was soon out of sight and out of mind. I continue driving along, and I'm back in chill mode again, when suddenly, a car with its high beams on appears directly behind me. What the hell? I quickly realized it was the same Mustang from before. They had been waiting alongside the highway for me. I nervously looked down to make sure my phone was still charging, just in case I needed it. It was. The Mustang switches lanes and flies up beside me, keeping pace for a few seconds. The driver then swerves in front of me, then suddenly brakes, bringing the car to a halt. I swerve into the other lane. The Mustang quickly speeds up beside me and starts swerving, trying to knock me off the road. They charge ahead again and try the same braking maneuver once more. At this point, I am freaking out. Now, I'm a 6'3", 220-pound male who works out all the time. I don't easily get scared. But in this situation, size did not matter. I note the license plate on the car and grab my phone. But as I do, the Mustang is suddenly beside me again and begins swerving. I jerk my wheel to the side and my phone goes flying out of my hands into the passenger side doorwell. Shit! The Mustang is then behind me, flashing its brights, right on my bumper, speeding up, slowing down, blaring its horn, swerving from side to side. They suddenly take off and are soon out of sight. I take the opportunity to collect myself and drive the remaining 10 minutes to the turnoff road to Athens. I make a quick decision to drive to the police station to file a report. I had the license plate number memorized and had been reciting it over and over again. As I turn off the road to Athens, bright headlights fill my rearview mirror again, and the Mustang is behind me. It speeds past me, turns down another road, and is gone. I arrived at the police station and give them the license plate number. It's a fairly small station, and I think there was only one officer working. He tells me that it's probably somebody mistaking me for somebody else. He runs the plate number and tells me the owner of those tags is deceased. Holy shit. Now I'm really freaked out. I finish filing the report and head home. The story doesn't end there. Later that night, when I was on the phone with my girlfriend, someone outside beats loudly on my garage door several times. Before I could get out to see who it was, I heard a squeal of tires. I never saw a car, but I called the cops immediately, and there has never been any kind of follow-up. I didn't sleep for several nights after that.
So this guy, he's a liar, but his lies are about to make him rich. Let's call him Francis. And Francis is 16, he's from New York, and he can't stay out of trouble. He's always lying and stealing from his parents and stealing from local businesses. But then one day, he commits forgery, and he gets arrested. Here's his mugshot. And after he's bailed out, Francis goes on another crime spree, and he eventually steals a car and flees to California. And then a few weeks later, he's arrested there. And they send him back to New York, where he has a bunch of outstanding warrants. And then, back in New York, Francis uses a bunch of forged checks to purchase an airline pilot's uniform. Because he thinks if he dresses like a pilot, which is a well-respected job, businesses will be more likely to trust him and cash his fake checks. But this plan doesn't really work, because he gets arrested for trying to use stolen checks, and he spends the next 2 years in prison. And by the time he gets out, he's 19. And a month later, he's arrested again in Boston for trying to steal a car and writing more bad checks. So they send him back to prison for another year. He's 20 now. So he eventually gets out and continues to be a turd. He gets that old pilot's uniform he bought, and he uses it to scam a few free flights from the airlines. Because I guess off-duty pilots get free flights. But then he gets arrested in Baton Rouge for stealing a bunch of checks from a family who was trying to help him. And from there, he eventually flees to Europe. And there, he's right back to stealing cars and cashing fake checks in France and Sweden. And then he gets arrested in France, and he's deported back to the US. He's 22 now. And now that he's back in the US, surprise, surprise, he goes right back to dressing up as a pilot and cashing more forged checks. 4 months later, he's caught and arrested again. And while he's in jail, he escapes. But within a few days, they catch him again trying to cash yet another forged check. And this time, he's sentenced to 12 years in prison. But a few years later, he gets out on parole. Then he's arrested again, this time for stealing art supplies and cameras from a children's summer camp. Here's his mugshot. And so at this point, Francis is around 26. And around this time, he moves into his parole officer's garage so his parole officer can keep an eye on him. And it's here that it finally seems like he's starting to learn his lesson. Until Francis is around 27 at this point, and he decides to start his own anti-fraud consulting company. And he starts holding these crime prevention seminars where he gives speeches. So he gives these speeches and he tells everyone he's a reformed criminal. But he doesn't just tell people about all the check fraud and stealing from people and dressing up as a pilot to get free flights. No. Instead, he starts making up these fantastical stories about how from the age of 16 to 20, he had snuck into a hospital and had pretended to be a pediatrician for an entire year, and how he had pretended to be a lawyer for another whole year, and how he faked being a sociology professor at BYU for a few semesters, and that he stole $2.5 million from the airlines, and that the FBI had been chasing after him for years, and he made some kind of daring escape through an airline toilet. And all of these stories are bullshit. I mean, these aren't just small embellishments. These are things that he completely makes up. And we know this because during the age when he supposedly did all this stuff, he was locked up in prison. All of which is public record. The only thing he really did was write a bunch of bad checks, rip off a few of his friends, and scam a handful of free flights. But none of that ends up mattering, because when Francis tells these fantastical stories about how he faked being a pediatrician for a year, or a lawyer, or whatever, people are fascinated. Like, they love hearing him say this stuff. And eventually, Francis's bullshit stories become so popular, he gets invited to do a guest appearance on a game show where he repeats these lies.
I worked there for a year as chief resident of a hospital.
And people watching just eat it up. They love him. After that, he gets invited onto the Today Show. Then he gets invited onto the Johnny Carson Show several times, where, again, he repeats these lies.
How did you pass yourself as a pediatrician?
I supervised 7 interns on the midnight to 8 shift.
And these appearances on Johnny Carson really blow him up. Suddenly, he's getting all kinds of media attention. People want to know more about him. So he teams up with an author and writes an autobiography. But not about his actual life, about these fake stories he made up. So then 2 years later, his book of made-up stories about his life gets published. And you've heard of it. It's called Catch Me If You Can. And it quickly becomes a New York Times bestseller. And then Francis sells the movie rights. And 17 years later, the rights end up at DreamWorks. And they make a movie directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio. And the movie goes on to be a huge hit. And years after that, they adapt it into a Broadway musical. And this whole time, even after the success of the book and the movie, Francis is out there doing guest appearances and giving public speeches, telling these same made-up stories about his life to huge crowds.
I spent about a year practicing law. In both the job as the lawyer and the doctor, no one ever doubted for a second I was not.
And it wasn't until more recently, in the age of the internet, that journalists really start to dig in and fact-check him in a real way. And they track his whole life through interviews and public records, and they realize Francis isn't some brilliant impersonator. He's just a pathological liar. And to this day, he's still running his anti-fraud company, and he's still out there giving speeches. Shout out to Hollywood.